I'm Michael Green. I'm the CEO of the U.S. Studies Center. Thank you very much for joining us here in the beautiful Mint. We love doing events here on the land of the Gadigal people, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We're here for the production and rollout of the U.S. Studies Center's Red Book, Blue Book, which is an effort to anticipate what either a Trump or Biden administration would look like, what it would try to do, what the debates would be, what would change, what wouldn't change, what it means for Australia, what it means for Japan and Korea and other American friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific. We produced this in 2020, and so this is our second real full Red Book, Blue Book. I came here about 2 years ago from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS in Washington. And CSIS is one of the major think tanks in DC. And working on this with Jared and the team, it occurred to me, the big think tanks in the United States don't do this. You won't find a Brookings Institution or CSIS or Carnegie or Council on Foreign Relations report on what a Trump or Biden administration, a Bush or Gore administration would do. The nonpartisan think tanks in Washington, and I was part of one, are very happy to give recommendations to whoever wins, but very rarely try to forecast and understand what might happen. So this is actually, I've come to appreciate, a unique product, not just for Australia, but globally. So you can be sure that we will be promoting this in Canada and Japan and Korea and India and elsewhere, because it stands alone. We approached it with the spirit that the center has in terms of our value proposition. The motto we have up there is Analysis of America, Insight for Australia. We've added a third piece, which is Solutions for the Alliance. So when we do reports like this, we try to have dispassionate analysis, but lead towards some actionable ideas for government and business, which we think we've done with this. If you follow the U.S. election, and I certainly know that every Uber driver I've ever had in Sydney does. I went to Washington in mid-March with Maria and others for 5 days with my friends, family, congressional staff at White House, met, had coffees, caught up. No one talked about the election. As soon as I got in an Uber at the airport, boom, who's going to win the election? In 2016, when both the US and Australia had national elections, data showed that Australians downloaded twice as many stories about the American election than Australia's election. So there's obviously huge interest, which is great. But our report tries to go a little deeper. For the social scientists in the room, you know that when you look at a country or a period of history or an organization, you have to make sense of agency and structure, of people and of larger institutions and historical trends. And while there's a lot of coverage of the US election, it's almost all agency. What did Donald Trump say? Did Joe Biden say something off? Did Donald Trump say something strange again? It's all agents, it's all people, and people matter, and leaders matter. I worked in the White House for 5 years and saw that. But the journalists don't usually get to the structure. What are the larger forces that shape history beyond people? And they're important. The US political system is a federal system like Australia, but it's a presidential system with checks and balances. When Donald Trump was president, for example, and he mused about pulling troops out of Korea, a Republican Congress introduced legislation in the Defense Authorization Act saying the president cannot use congressionally appropriated funds to pull troops out of Korea, Japan, or NATO. So there was the constant check and balance game going on, which was a result of the structure of the American Constitution and way of government. Structure matters in terms of historical forces and interests. The American people overwhelmingly in polls support alliances, especially with Australia. American farmers, American ranchers have huge interest in international trade. So there are interest groups, there's historical commitments that are quite powerful. And then the structure of international relations and geopolitics, the China challenge. One of the few truly bipartisan areas in Congress and in Washington is around the need to have a strategy to respond to China's challenge and the central importance of US alliances. So all these structural factors appear, frankly, very rarely in the media because the agency, the leaders are so fascinating or disturbing, depending on your point of view. So we look at leaders in this, but we spend a lot of time on structure and history and institutions and interests to try to see what matters to Australia and to America's friends. Australians will not get a say in the election. Putin's trying. In 2004, the Guardian newspaper thought it would be a good idea to have their readers write letters to citizens of one county in Ohio, which was then a swing state, urging them to vote for John Kerry and against George W. Bush, and the turnout for Bush went way up. Australia's never tried that. But Australia does have agency, does have influence, almost unparalleled, certainly up there with Japan and Britain, in a unique club in how campaigns, and I've worked on several campaigns, presidential campaigns, how campaigns debate policy, how transition teams decide what to do, how to resolve the disagreements that emerged in the campaign, how new officials do their job. Australia is very well positioned, has an excellent embassy in Washington to shape that part of the process. But forewarned is forearmed. So we're doing our bit to sort of get people, or help people think through what that looks like. We'll have two panels. Jared will moderate the first, but we're delighted and grateful that we'll have Dr. Hugh McDermott open with some initial thoughts for us. Hugh is in the New South Wales Parliament, as you know, represents Prospect. He's the co-chair of the New South Wales Parliamentary Friendship Group with the United States. He's been a friend and supporter of the Centre. He knows quite a bit about these issues. He has a PhD in law from King's College London, University of London, postgraduate law degrees from the University of Technology, Sydney, and the University of Sydney, BA in political science and economic history from the University of He could have written this. But we're just asking him to introduce the theme. So Hugh, thanks very much for kicking things off.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for inviting me tonight. I got an embargoed copy, so I've actually read it. I don't know if anyone else has, apart from the researchers, but I've actually read it from page to page, from end to end, and it's a great document. Firstly, I'd just like to say that there is a strong relationship between Australia and the US, and everybody knows that, but also the state. I mean, going well back, more than 100 years. We talk about the Second World War and what we did then, but it goes back well before that, back to the Eureka Stockade when the Californians send horse troops out and all the trade and everything else that's happened over many, many years. I'm very interesting for me, spending time overseas, obviously studying at King's. I have a lot of friends in the US who are also exchange students and other things like that. And then I worked in the Caribbean for many years. I was a lawyer and had a lot of clients in Florida and New York, other places like that. A girlfriend based in DC for 2 years, and amongst other things. So the relationship has been very strong. I also have the largest industrial base in the Southern Hemisphere in my electorate. So there are American companies. So the relationship builds more and more. And with the submarine deal that's been done, we hope it will build way beyond that. The thing that really struck me about the Red Book, Blue Book is you can tell it hasn't just been written by academics. There is the academic side of it, which is really important, having the evidence and backup, but you can see often when you hear political analysis outside of politics, not from people who've worked in the actual White House, haven't worked in the Parliament, haven't been staffers or MPs. Often they'll have a mystical view of what politics is. They'll have a mystical view of why decisions were made, rather than the real politic of why it was done. My Premier, Chris Minns, recently won an award with Dominic Perrottet because they did kumbaya together in the last election campaign. And everyone said that was wonderful, it changed the views. Well, the reality was we came up with that because we wanted to undermine Dominic Perrottet, that every time he attacked Chris, he looked like an asshole, right? So he couldn't do it. So it's great they gave us awards for it, but really it was the real politic of trying to win an election. And that's the truth. And if you look at this document, you can see also that we look at the issues, not only with Biden, if he wins, or with Trump, but the real impact and the recommendations, cutting right through what could actually happen. And I thought it was very interesting what Michael said, that you could repeat this formula time and again with India and Singapore and other countries, and you're absolutely right. And I haven't ever seen a document quite like this. Often when you'll sit with the bureaucrats in Canberra, policymakers here in New South Wales, they'll come up with ideas of what perhaps we should do, but they haven't actually engaged enough. And I think this document is really a linchpin for doing that. And so I'm very, very pleased to be here so I can actually say this about this document. I look forward to passing this on to all my colleagues in the Parliament, especially those who are involved with the Parliamentary Friends of the US. We have discussed US policy quite a lot, and as you said, it's always on the television, everything that's going on. But the reality is that no matter who wins this election, it will only have a significant influence on Australia as far as our policies go and our industries, etc. But it doesn't change the friendship, and I think that's key. You know, I think everyone was shocked when Trump won, right? I certainly was. I would never have guessed it, but we learnt to deal with it, and it really changed nothing in the end. Sure, we could have a whinge about certain things, and I'm sure colleagues on the other side of the chamber also claimed the same thing when Biden came in. But what didn't change was our strength in our trade relationship, the strength in what we believe as democracies, but other players, China and others, are also trying to influence the world agenda, and we do it together. And so the Red Book, Blue Book, you know, is a great guide, and I'm so pleased to be here. I'm so pleased that I was one of the first to read it, and I look forward, as the night progresses, to hear the views of the panel and others. Unfortunately, I have to go and give out a community awards in Western Sydney a bit later tonight, so I'll be leaving a bit earlier. But congratulations, Michael. Congratulations to the whole team at the US Study Centre, and I look forward to seeing what the next publication comes in and watching Biden win the next election. All right, so cheers.
Thank you. If I could ask my panelists to join me.
Where do you want us?
I'll sit here, Mike, if you want to sit there. There we go. Thank you so much for the kind words. That was very generous. And I have to say that this, before we get started, that this could not have been done without a fantastic team at the Study Center, whether it be the excellent research associates who are co-authors on this, to the staff from our comms team and our production team, to our events team who have just made the rollout of this, both in Canberra yesterday and Sydney today, fantastic. So thank you so much for everyone's contributions on that. I'm glad to do this as the editor of this. I get to now probe the authors a bit more on these issues. We're running a little short on time. So what I'm going to do is maybe we'll start with some opening remarks from my panelists here to give some food for thought. But I want to make sure we save some time for questions from the audience. As you flagged, Mike, we've updated our motto here to include solutions for the alliance. I guess I would love to maybe start with some opening remarks framed around what's the problem. And what maybe some solutions as well as from your perspective, but what are the problems we're looking at? I mean, Mike, you did a great piece on alliances. Haley did trade analysis and has some thoughts on critical minerals, and Pete has great thoughts on AUKUS, but what are the problems with them? So if we could just start with that, and then we can eventually have a bit of a conversation before opening up to the audience, that'd be great. And Mike, I'll start with you. We'll go down the line.
Thank you. The first thing to say is really obvious, which is this election is going to probably be extremely close. Because of the Electoral College, it could be a few tens of thousands of votes in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin that make the difference. So it's prudent to sort of think through both the red and the blue. But the purple is the biggest part of this book. As Jared has pointed out before, the continuity is going to be the majority of the story. I wrote the section on alliances and began by acknowledging that Donald Trump is probably the most deliberately decisive presidential figure we've had. Abraham Lincoln was more divisive, but he wasn't trying to be. So I don't think that counts. But Donald Trump, from his early time in the outer boroughs of New York, trying to get into the Manhattan market, was an agent provocateur to do that. He's gone to court over more than 4,000 times. It's a lot of lawyers who put a lot of kids through school. Almost all of them he settled. They were all combative. That's his style. When he was running for president, he said some things that were pretty shocking for allies. He said to the New York Times that if Japan and Korea didn't pay more, or he can get rid of the trade imbalances that he didn't like, he might pull troops out. David Sanger from the New York Times, who's coming to be a fellow with us, by the way, in August, David said, well, what do you do if Japan or North Korea or South Korea develop nuclear weapons? And Donald Trump said, whatever. And so, I mean, as you can imagine, in Seoul and Tokyo, this was big news. At the end of the Trump administration, I think senior officials from the Abe government and probably the Morrison government would say, you know what, in very specific ways, our alliance has got stronger, actually. It's a little bit like the Mark Twain line about the music of Richard Wagner. Wasn't as bad as it sounded. The reason is what I said earlier. The American public overwhelmingly supports alliances. The Congress, on a very broad bipartisan basis, supports alliances. And the checks and balances sort of righted the ship. Not everywhere. I think NATO and European allies had a much harder time than US allies in Asia, for example. But one of the things that points to the continuity is the Trump administration stumbled into some Asia policy pillars like the Quad, or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, or the infrastructure financing. These were Abe's ideas from Japan, actually, and Biden kept them after Trump. The key elements of the Asia strategy went from Trump to Biden. Biden moved the Quad from a foreign ministers meeting to a summit. So the continuity is pretty clear. Some people will say, yeah, but this time it's going to be much worse because the Trump MAGA extremists will be ready, and the Heritage Foundation in Washington and the America First Institute has these grandiose plans to get rid of the deep state and send in loyalists. I've worked on 4 presidential campaigns. To be fair, I only won one, but I know a little bit about presidential campaigns. This always happens. These are coalitions, and think tanks and labor unions and business associations, but especially think tanks, claim they have the plan, and they're the ones who are going to decide. And it's always contested. And what you don't see in the media is the significant number of Republicans in the House and Senate, people on Wall Street who will also go into an administration, and because they can be confirmed, are much more likely to end up being Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury. So it'll be a scrum. It'll be a scrum. And it's always like that in the transition from politics to governing in the US. It'll be a much bigger scrum if Trump wins. And Australia is going to have its game on. And Kevin Rudd is already on it. It's going to have to be talking to people and playing in that process. And look, if Biden wins, which is statistically is probably equally likely, I'd actually argue more likely. We can get into that if you want. It would be a mistake for Australia or Canada or Japan or US farmers or business to just breathe a sigh of relief. I think you got to put pressure on a Biden administration to get more serious about trade policy and economic statecraft. And second-term Democratic administrations, Clinton and Obama, both did that. NAFTA, TPP, happened after the election. So bottom line is Australia has agency and is not alone, because Japan and Canada and the UK and a lot of US allies are going to be doing the same thing.
Thanks, Mike. Haley.
Yeah. Thanks, Jared. Well, look, I think people who come here tonight to this event come because they want questions answered about what's going to happen, whether it's Trump or Biden. So I thought I'd start off by saying what are the most frequent questions that I get asked by friends or family about Trump or Biden, right? So one of the questions I get asked is, they're too old. They're a country of more than 300 million people. Is this the best they've got? What happens if one of them dies? And if Trump wins, is it the end of democracy? So to answer those questions in order, they're too old. Yes, they're too old. They're out of touch, and I think younger people would be more in touch with a larger amount of the population. Is this the best they've got? No, it's not the best they've got, but the reason that you have Biden and Trump running again is because of brand awareness, name awareness, and that's why you have familial dynasties like the Bushes or the Clintons running, and why we might have, Trump Jr. running in future, or his daughter. What happens if one of them dies? Well, there are other people waiting in the wings on both sides of the party, and I think Mike, Jared, Victoria or Bruce could tell you who the second, third and fourth choices are for the Democrats and the Republicans. And if Trump wins, is this the end of democracy? No, it is not the end of democracy. It just means that democracy is playing out in a way that is different than we have seen before, and the reasons for why it's different I will get into later, but it doesn't mean that democracy is dead. And then the other thing I wanted to address before handing over to Pete is actually to address very directly why Australians are concerned about this election. The reason Australians are concerned is because there are real things to be concerned about. Mainly, it is that Trump doesn't represent the highest moral values or standards that we have come to expect, cherish and admire in the United States. Now, I also want to say that at the Centre, we do not represent our own personal views, and I won't be representing my personal views here. We are nonpartisan and independent. But what I will say is that there have been criticisms levelled at Trump that go along the lines of he's a racist, he's sexist, he condones dictators like Putin and Kim Jong-un. And in addition to concerns around Trump the man and what he stands for, there's also concerns about what's happening domestically in the United States. So there was the January 6th riot, there's the repeal of abortion rights, there's gun violence like we've never seen before, and there's the perception, real or imagined, that the United States is not standing up equally for people's rights around the world in various conflicts. And just on the gun violence issue, I just came from an Australian Investment Council event, and one of the people who spoke said there's a lot of opportunity for Australian business to stay in Australia and for Australian venture capital to stay in Australia and not go to the United States because the US is too dangerous and a lot of people don't want to put their children through active shooter drills and send their children to American schools. So the concerns around safety in America are front and centre. But all of that being said, there's also reasons why we are seeing a distorted picture of the United States and not a fully unbiased and accurate view. The reasons that make America look worse than it actually is are threefold. The first is media. Frankly, car crash TV is just good TV, and sometimes seeing things bad happen is like the ultimate reality TV show, and we see that a lot in the United States. We're not hearing news from countries in our own region like China, and the reason for that is because journalists have been expelled, jailed, or disappeared. And we also don't hear much from other countries in our region because they don't have English media or English language media. The second reason why the United States looks worse than it is because the US doesn't have compulsory voting. So the two leaders are always going to be campaigning on the absolute extremes of the left and the right, because that's where their bases are. So they're always going to look more extreme to an Australian audience because we have compulsory voting, so our parties are always pushed to the middle and they look more normal. And the third and final reason why the US looks worse than it actually is because the clue is in the name. It is the United States. The US is made up of 50 different states, and if you can leave with only one message tonight, all of those states act like mini countries in themselves. So the US has to govern states like frozen Alaska to humid Florida, from conservative Texas to liberal California, and governing a democracy that represents the values, cultures, religions and traditions as diverse as the world we live in is just a really hard job. It's not easy. And so for those reasons, the US doesn't look as good as it actually is, and we shouldn't be as worried as we sometimes are.
Thanks. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Hayley. I'll talk less about, obviously, domestic politics and more about foreign and defence policy. And I thought I'd start with the headline, which is the question I always get asked doing my job is, what's going to happen to AUKUS? I always and constantly get the AUKUS question. So I thought I might take a stab at sort of addressing the AUKUS question. So I'll do the quick and simple and short part, If Joe Biden is re-elected, of course, AUKUS will continue. But the focus of AUKUS, I think, will fundamentally shift away from the nuclear-powered submarines, which has dominated the headlines and the policy making. Now that we have the optimal pathway in place, now that we have key pieces of legislation, the focus will shift over to more focus on AUKUS Pillar 2, onto the advanced capabilities and the advanced technologies. And I notice Mike Horowitz, who's running and working on this area in the Pentagon at the moment, just did an interview overnight with Breaking Defence to sort of lay out a broader agenda of what they're doing on Pillar 2, and for instance announcing some key and critical developments with P8 maritime patrol aircraft software and other such developments. So that's the easy part. The question people though do ask me is, will Donald Trump get rid of AUKUS? And I fundamentally believe that AUKUS will survive and thrive no matter who wins the election in November. Now, that's not to say it won't be a bumpy ride if Donald Trump could be elected. But I'll go through a sort of my very quickly my top 10 hits of why I think it will survive.
Who needs
First
David
is-
Letterman when we have Pete Dean?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Top 10, my top 10 records. So, as Mike said, the first one is, in an increasingly polarised political system, China is the thing that is unifying Congress and politics, and Trump is focused, and Trump's potential officials in his administration are focused on this as well. Mike and I were discussing, he mentioned it the other day, reminded me of my US history degree, that most of the extreme elements of sort of US isolationism we saw in the 20s and the 30s was more about anti-Europe and pro-Asia and engagement in our part of the world. And you can see very much that sort of theme going through many of the Trump sort of supporters. They're very much focused on, can they actually pivot out of Europe and into Asia? That's not necessarily the right thing in my view, but that's very much what they're focused upon. Secondly, while the president is the commander-in-chief, he does not control US foreign policy because of the congressional system and the very big and very important role Congress has to play, particularly in funding initiatives. So we saw, as Mike said, when Trump threatened to pull troops out of South Korea, what did the Congress do? Responded by putting amendments in the NDAA saying, you may want to do that, but we're not going to fund it. And given the very, very strong bipartisan support we've had in around AUKUS in Congress, I would imagine that if there was some types of threats, that Congress would move pretty quickly in a similar type of direction. Thirdly, it's deeply embedded into the bureaucracy now. There is not a single AUKUS person like we used to have in the administration when it first set up that Trump could walk in and say, you're fired, and sort of dismantle it that way. It's now embedded through the Pentagon, through the US Navy, through the bureaucracy, and the National Defence Authorisation Act, basically, and its changes in 2024, has made AUKUS pretty much business as usual. I'd say that it's not an alliance. Despite what you will read in most mainstream newspapers, every time AUKUS is mentioned, it is not underlined in capital letters, ! and alliance. It's not. It's a technology sharing pact. And so while Trump has big problems with alliances in general, things that are about technology sharing, trade, investment, innovation are fundamentally different to what security alliances are as well. Fifth, it's not NATO. That actually, given Trump's predilection, that's going to really stand. And in fact, the fact that AUKUS gets up the nose of the French, and particularly President Macron, almost every week will really play in our favour, because Trump had fundamental issues with France and Macron in particular. So if you're going to play the man and not the ball, this is a really good thing to continue to play. The more Macron speaks about that and is upset about it, they're actually probably better it plays in if Trump starts to pay attention. It also, it is a really significant investment from us into the United States as a result of this. $3 billion Australian dollars into the US submarine industrial base. Like, if you're wanting to look at the art of the deal, you can easily say to President Trump, this is a good deal. We're doing it out of our national interest, because if you have a production line that only produces 3 things a year and you want one of them to make 4, if you don't invest in increasing the production line, you're not going to get your product at the end of it. But there is long-term benefits to the United States defence capability and industry sector that will be as a result of this. Add this, number 7, add the investment we're making and the good deal that AUKUS is for the United States to the fact that Australia is now spending over 2%, at 2.2% of GDP on defence. And the fact that our new National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Plan has charted out a 10-year program of increasing our defence funding from $55 billion to $100 billion a year. Add those things together, and what are we doing? Everything that Trump said in his last term of office that he wanted US allies to do. Spend more than 2% of GDP, be more self-reliant in your own defence, and contribute to broader regional deterrence and the balance of power. So we are literally tick, tick, tick every box down the list, in contrast to some of the other countries in Europe and around the world that he's not so necessarily happy about. Eighth, Trump doesn't know what AUKUS is. And at the moment, that's probably a good thing. If you saw the interview about Kevin Rudd, the question from Nigel Farage started as an AUKUS question, blank look from the Donald, quickly pivot to, well, Kevin Rudd said this. Clearly no idea who Kevin Rudd was either, right? And he went into his standard response when someone criticises him. But I actually think it's good that it flies under the radar at the moment. My great fear is that Biden brings it up in a debate or something and Trump suddenly pays attention to it. Because if he doesn't pay attention to it, that brings me down to my next one, my ninth one. That means it's going to largely be run by the national security officials that he puts into government. And if you look at some of the key people, as Mike said, that are looking for positions or potentials for this, people like Mike Gallagher and Dan Sutherland, people like Steve Bannon, have all come out either very favourably about Australia or they're fundamental supporters of AUKUS in Congress or in the national security community. Yes, there's a couple of people floating around that have raised a few questions about it, but we hunted very hard for every comment out of every Trump official or Trump or anyone for what they said about AUKUS, and the only things we could find were positive mentions about AUKUS and positive mentions about Australia. And finally, when this all boils down to it, Trump will make an assessment on US national interests, and so will his government, and this is in our national interest as much as it is in their national interests. So it's much easier to sell something, you know, always back self-interest, as they say, and there's a huge degree of American self-interest in making AUKUS work. Now, I'll finish with saying it's not without risk. You know, the president, whoever gets in his ear first and might whisper something, or if he gets a bee in his bonnet, or he sees that it's a Biden signature initiative that he wants to change, he might become obsessed about it. And if he becomes obsessed about it, we never know where that direction might go. As I said, we saw last time there are, you know, the scrum, as Mike talks about. In the scrum, it depends on which people in that community might get more of a voice and more of a say. If it's some people who've got some questions raised about AUKUS, we might have to be fighting a bit more of a defensive battle to influence things. And lastly, I mentioned Congress. Congress is really critically important. I commend to all of you the work that a couple of members of my team, Alice and Tom, did on Asia policy in Congress and Bruce's piece on Congress as well. But there is a substantially large number of congressmen and women who are retiring, far more than normal this time around. Many of them who are senior people in the foreign and defence areas. We're going to have to work very hard through our embassy on, you know, educating those new members, ensuring we meet those connections and ensuring that Congress remains supportive of AUKUS through into the future.
Thanks, Pete. One thing that I've said as we've been talking to stakeholders about this report is, in my view, no country did better than Australia during the Trump administration. And there is, as Mike said, structural aspects to that play to Australia's favor. And there's also, as Pete said, a lot that Australia is doing, I think, to be the model ally. And I think also, as Haley said, Australia, in my view, has been wise about how to understand Trump. But one thing I've also been saying is the best that Australia could do is prepare for Trump, because even if you prepare for Trump, Biden will be pleasantly surprised. Will be happy, because that will mean, you know, doing exactly what we talked about, bolstering military spending and taking up more burden sharing in the region. But I feel like there's also, as Mike said, the agents, the relationship managers in the alliance who, in the first Trump administration and still in this Biden administration as well, have done really well and been very wise in prosecuting and pushing Australia's case forward. But I guess one thing I'd love to know before we open up to questions is, what's a concern you have moving forward for Australia in a Trump or Biden administration? I mean, especially, I think we saw some allies, we'll go to you first, Mike, treat Trump a bit differently than Australia. What's something that you think are maybe some lessons learned from the Trump administration that we should try to relearn, perhaps?
Do you want me to also do what worries me, or just the?
Both. So, lessons learned and any top concern moving forward.
I'm not at all worried about AUKUS. There's one official, former Trump official, who was not particularly high level, happens to be a friend of mine, who gets quoted all the time because he's a clickbait guy and he loves to get quoted, who has said we shouldn't be spending AUKUS, we should do something else to confound the Chinese. It's one guy. I think then that's it. And on the Hill, the only opposition to AUKUS ever that came up was Senator Wicker, because he was worried that the administration's defense budget for U.S. submarine production was not enough to allow both. He held firm. Probably a lot of people in Russell panicked, and he won. And the U.S. spending $13 billion on the industrial base. It was not about AUKUS. It was not about Australia. It's like, can we really afford to do this given our demands? And they solved it. So I'm not worried about AUKUS. I'm not too worried about troop withdrawals. I think that's a lot of 4,000 law cases, 4,000 court cases. That's how you harass and negotiate, and Congress will be there. I worry about a crisis. In a crisis, you want someone at the helm who doesn't play those games. I worry a little bit about. I worry a lot about Ukraine, but not. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, went to Donald Trump. He used to be Trump's lawyer. Most people don't know that. And he went to Mar-a-Lago and he convinced Trump not to oppose his effort to get funding for Ukraine. I think that's a really important precedent. So there are things to worry about. AUKUS is not one of them, in my view. I worry about workforce for AUKUS. That's a thing. Lessons learned. Look, Scott Morrison, Shinzo Abe, Modi, certain leaders did fine with Trump. And what was the secret sauce? Quiz John, because he was chief of staff.
Which we will on the next panel.
I'm not saying John was the secret sauce. Don't engage in virtue signaling to a domestic audience about Donald Trump. That's what some European leaders did. That's what Trudeau did at times. You virtue signal to your domestic public about Donald Trump. There may be demand signals from it, from your domestic media or even your own party. But you can't do that and expect the White House won't notice. And Morrison, Abe, and others were quite disciplined. And that's the key thing. The leaders who thought they could sort of run against Trump domestically, virtue signal, even if they were right, frankly, on some of the merits, did great harm to their country's interests.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, lessons and worries.
Lessons learned and any top concerns.
Okay. So my program at the US Study Center is called Economic Security, and in part it deals with trade, supply chains, and regional economic frameworks. And when I say frameworks, I'm talking about things like the World Trade Organization and other groupings of countries in the region that come together usually to do a multilateral free trade agreement. And trade really matters to Australia. So I thought we should do, there's that industry super ad, compare the pair. Let's compare the pair. So when you look at trade, supply chains, and regional economic frameworks, you might be shocked, surprised to learn that actually Biden and Trump are very similar in a number of ways, but the way they present themselves is what's quite different, but the substance is the same. So, for example, on trade and issues to do with free trade, when Trump was in power, he put tariffs on countries for steel and aluminium, and he stopped doing free trade agreements. And when Biden came to power, people thought that he would reverse that trend, go back to free trade, and that's not what happened. The tariffs remained, and actually more restrictions came on trading partners. So Biden was in some ways worse than Trump. In terms of supply chains, when I think about supply chains, one of the most important ones is around critical minerals. Critical minerals are critical. They go into everything from the clean energy transition to technology to high-end defence capability like F-35 jets, drones and missiles. And what's really good about critical minerals is that we have a lot of them. We're the world's largest producer of lithium. We also have massive reserves of magnesium, cobalt, nickel. All these things go into clean energy tech like wind turbines, solar, large capacity batteries. And the way that Trump and Biden are different, they both love critical minerals, but they love them for different reasons. So Biden likes critical minerals for the clean energy revolution that we're having. Trump loves critical minerals for the defence and security aspects and the technology and the semiconductors and all of that kind of jazz. So Australia's in a really good position because whoever's in the White House, we will just market our critical minerals to whoever that is differently. And then lastly, on the regional economic frameworks, again, Trump and Biden are similar because under the World Trade Organization, for instance, both Biden and Trump are really frustrated with that system. They're frustrated because in the early 2000s, the US supported China's membership of the WTO, and the great hope was that China would join the WTO and it would liberalise and take on democratic values, and then over time it would just be sort of collected with the other countries and behave itself. And that is not at all what China did. It broke the rules in the WTO by issuing huge domestic subsidies and basically restricting trade in ways that the WTO didn't allow. And there was no mechanism in the WTO to rein in China. And so both Biden and Trump are frustrated by it. And what concerns them the most out of trade, supply chains and regional economic frameworks is the trade piece. And the reason that is because Austrade tells us that almost half of Australia's gross domestic product is from trade, and a third of our trade is with China. We are a trading nation. When China cut off trade with us, the free market economy helped reallocate those resources and find other markets for them all around the world. And if the US walks back from that system, we don't know what will happen, but it's not good. And so that's what really worries me.
Any top lesson learned from our experience with Trump and Biden? We've had 4 years of each.
Yeah. Well, I think the way that you deal with Trump is ingratiate yourself with him. I think Shinzo Abe, when he was Prime Minister, had a psychologist analyse Trump and how to deal with Trump. And I read this piece and it said that the psychologist recommended that you say the name Trump many times to him. And you always thank him and basically tell him he's the best, and you will get currency out of that interaction. And Japan managed the Trump relationship really well. I actually think Malcolm Turnbull managed the relationship really well too, because Turnbull's a rich businessman and he didn't like to get pushed around, and he knew that Trump would respect that if Turnbull stood fast. In terms of lessons for Biden, honestly, the biggest lesson is that economic nationalism is ruling and workers' rights are ruling, and we see Biden marching for the first time in like union picket lines. That's never happened before. And so I think that the lesson is the US will be more domestically focused regardless of which president it is, but it will be easier to deal with Biden because he's a nicer person. I didn't know how to finish that thought.
I mean, some Asian countries.
It's very analytical.
I was like, he'll just be easier for reasons we all know here.
Pete.
Yeah, you can't disagree with the last statement. So compare the pair. I'm going to compare the meerkat. I'm in the market.
Yep.
To use another Australian analogy. Look, I'll start with the lesson. I think if Trump gets elected, there's going to be a lot of colour and shape and movement. And I remember when he was elected, I was following President Trump on Twitter, and you'd wake up every morning overnight in Australia going like, what the hell happened? And after a while, you realise so much of that was the smoke and mirrors component of it, and you can just get sucked in and absorbed into it like a bad soap opera. But when you stand back and look at it, one of the lessons, I think, is the level of continuity between some of the policies of the Trump regime and some of the policies of the Biden regime, particularly on economic nationalism, on China policy, on trade, on a whole range of things. So I think we've actually got to look at the policy. The lesson is to follow and watch the policy no matter who's in, and try and avoid some of the excesses of the car crash television stuff that's so easy to get hooked on. In terms of worries, I, like Mike, really worry about if Trump is elected and there's a crisis. Fundamentally, US, Australian and Japanese strategy in our region from a strategic policy point of view are in complete alignment. We're all doing deterrence. We're all looking for a balance of power. We're all doing deterrence by denial. And I'm going to get nerdy academically for a second, but deterrence only exists in the mind of the person or people or country you're trying to deter. That's how it works. So if we have a president, and so that means sort of intention and signalling is really key. And if you have a president whose signals are all over the shop, if you can't quite make out what is sort of going on in all these different elements and different parts, then fundamentally, I worry about what signals will the PRC, the DPRK and the Russians take out of this, and what opportunism that might lend themselves to if they think the United States is, or the President or others are distracted from that. And it's going to be just much harder doing that signalling, because you'll get certain words of reassurance, out of a Mike Pompeo or a Mike Gallagher or someone else in that area that might be completely contradictory to what Trump said, and we saw this last time. So it's a real worry for me. No matter who's elected, I have a worry, and that is China policy. Why it is bipartisan in the United States, and that's a good thing. I worry about the continual ability of both sides trying to out-China each other, be tougher on China and harder on China, and then I worry that the China policy could get out ahead of the rest of the allies in Asia, out ahead of Japan, out ahead of Korea, out ahead of Australia and the Philippines, and how we'll have to work to ensure that some of the things that are driven by economic nationalism as well don't have unintended consequences of impacting US allies in the region. And that's agency we have. I thoroughly believe with Mike, we have more agency than we ever had because we're more important to the United States. And a part of a good alliance relationship is also speaking truth to power, particularly in an asymmetric relationship where the US is much bigger than us. We've done that a lot in the past. We haven't had to do that for a long time, particularly when we're operating in the Middle East. But we might have to have, irrespective of who's in power, some more very frank conversations if US-China policy goes in directions that may be uncomfortable for us. The big thing I'll finish on is complacency. Just because we weathered the storm with President Trump last time doesn't mean this President Trump, if he's elected, would be the same. I really worry that people in Canberra are like, oh, look how well we handled it last time. We'll just roll out the same playbook. That's a real worry to me. He could be very different. We've got to look at the issues on the table and we're going to have to adjust as we go along. We can't rest on our laurels and say, we did it great last time, it'll just roll out well for us again next time.
Great. Mike, do you want to add one thing before we open up questions?
Yeah, I mean, Pete's right. He could be different. It's entirely possible he could be different in a better way.
Yeah,
It's entirely possible. Look at how he handled Mike Johnson and supported him getting legislation through on Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel.
Very different than Paul Ryan handled Donald Trump.
No, Johnson knows how to handle Trump. He gets mocked a lot in the press, but he actually was quite skillful. That tells you something. Trump has all the flaws we've been describing. He has an ego. We've talked about that. Second-term presidents do think a little bit, if he becomes one, about legacy. I don't think we can completely rule out the possibility, as Pete said, it could be worse, it could be better. You prepare. I just wanted to, when you're in the think tank business, you got to be scary, because if you're not, people don't pay attention. But you also have to be sort of analytical and provide context, and it's constant. So I want to put a little more context. I agree with everything that was said, but a little bit more about the economics bit. I worked on the U.S.-Australia Free Trade Agreement in the White House, U.S.-Korea, U.S.-Singapore, early TPP. Fundamentally believe that trade liberalization, Bretton Woods, that whole effort was a critical part of American national interest and strategy. So I was not happy when Donald Trump pulled out of TPP or Joe Biden refused to come back to TPP or really build more actual substance behind the Indo-Pacific economic framework. However, a few points for context. The U.S. average tariff rate is half of Europe's, half of Korea's. The only country in the G7 that has a lower average tariff rate, interestingly, is Japan, which is only 1.23%, which is amazing. My first job was in USTR in the late 80s, and Japan had the highest, you know. So keep that in mind. This is before you assume America's a protectionist country. In surveys we've done at the Study Center that I did at CSIS, when Americans are asked, should we decouple from China economically, you never get more than 20%. Usually it's 19-20%. You know how many Australians say we should decouple from China? 20%. So the American public's not actually uniquely protectionist. Union voters are really important in Western Pennsylvania and Michigan. That's why Biden marched. If they could decide this vote, that's true. It makes trade agreements hard. But the American public generally is not on some protectionist tear. I hate to admit this one, but people say, look, you know, Joe Biden put steel tariffs on our allies. Donald Trump put steel tariffs on our allies, and then Joe Biden kept them. You know who put steel tariffs on our allies before an election? George W. Bush, my guy. It was my job to call Abe and tell Michael Foley. Not fun. So the trends are definitely away from the free trade strategies that animated American approaches to the region. But there are a lot, again, back to structure, there are a lot of checks and balance and interests that people have to remember. I don't think Australia should be complacent at all. It needs to be highly vigilant about these economic issues, should be pushing quite hard, as interest groups in the US will, for making more of IPEF, maybe digital trade, the critical minerals. But the US, foreign direct investment, booming. China was Germany's largest trading partner 2 years ago. Today it's the US. China was Korea's largest trading partner 2 years ago. Today it's the US. So that's not a protectionist country. So I think we have to keep that context in mind and be vigilant and apply influence and ideas where it will be useful.
All right, very quickly, if I can have any hands for questions. If not, then, we have one. And then we'll quickly answer this before we take a quick break so we can switch mics and go to the next panel. Sorry, 1 second. For the break, yeah, you have about 30 seconds to talk amongst yourselves and while we switch microphones, and then get ready to hear more.
Yeah,
and if you could identify yourself.
My name's Michael McNeil. So the $3 billion for the AUKUS industrial platform over the 4 years, what's the likelihood of Trump or indeed Biden asking us to cough up more?
So just to clarify, that's $3 billion that Australia has given to the U.S. for AUKUS, in addition to the 13 that the U.S. has spent.
The $3 billion for the AUKUS industrial platform for Pillar 1, the subs.
Look, I think it's entirely possible that Trump may well look at this and want to renegotiate the deal, because that's how he envisions and sees himself. And if he wants to renegotiate the deal, he's going to ask us to cough up more money. The question would be how those negotiations go if it gets to that point. But I think it's a pretty, I mean, they had to change the law in the United States to allow this to happen, for the United States to receive money from us to be able to do this. So it's not like it's a bad deal to start with. But I think that's, we don't know. I mean, stuff like that is entirely plausible. The one thing I'll say is, John Bolton, if people know the former Ambassador Bolton and was Trump's national security advisor, I don't think there's been anything in my lifetime that I've ever agreed with John Bolton on, until he wrote a piece in, I think, in Foreign Affairs the other week that says that the problem with some of this stuff that we do on Trump is he doesn't know what he's going to do. So it's really hard for us to analyse. He's not like a traditional candidate in many ways. So that's an entirely plausible thing, and then it will come down to how well we negotiate. And how committed Trump is, or the people he appoints to do this are around it. So I think it's in the realm of possibility.
Again, back to agency structure, Donald Trump is not going to renegotiate AUKUS. So we have to keep, it's shorthand and easy to say Donald Trump will do this, Donald Trump wants that. Donald Trump's not going to renegotiate AUKUS. Somebody's going to have to renegotiate AUKUS, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Navy. So the real question is, will there be a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of the Navy, a National Security Advisor who want to renegotiate AUKUS? And I just don't see it. But however, it's possible he could say he wants to renegotiate AUKUS, And what happened the first term, I know past performance is not a guarantee of future earnings.
That's straight out of the super ad too.
Yes. But those cabinet positions, congressional positions are going to really matter. And the relationships with them is going to really matter. So this is it's not a avalanche coming down a mountain where you just sort of hope for the best.
Thank you. We're unfortunately out of time, so if you could just give us a round of applause for this fantastic panel, and then we'll move on to, thank you.
Yes, you do.
Now, as that was a fantastic panel, and they framed a lot of the big strategic concepts really well. We are running a bit behind time, so my plan with this panel, which is also a fantastic panel, is we'll run it a little bit more like a lightning round style. We'll run a little bit quicker through some of the key topics I want to hit on. And I'm going to see how the conversation goes, because I also want to make sure we have time for networking at the end. So depending on how we go for time for audience Q&A, if we're running out of time and I want to make sure we have time, we'll adjourn to the networking so that you can actually come and talk to the speakers and ask them questions directly. Because I do feel it's really important that you have that chance to interact and to engage. But we'll see how we're going. So just quickly, my name's Mari Kirk. I'm the Director of Engagement and Impact with the USSC. And this is a very fantastic panel we have tonight. We're going to move into a little bit more of the tactical or on the political side of it, because we have two people in particular on this panel who I think it'll be great for us to pick their brain while we have them. So seated next to me, we have Dr. John Kunkel, who is a Senior Economic Advisor at the USSC, but previously he was Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Scott Morrison. So he had to brief an incoming Prime Minister on how to engage with the Trump administration. And then and the Biden, yeah, you would have had to do both Biden and Trump. So, great perspective there. On the end, we have Bruce Wolpe, who's a non-resident senior fellow with the USSC and one of Australia's most prolific commentators on US politics, on media. You'll see him all over the place all the time. But he was former senior advisor to Julia Gillard when she was Prime Minister, and he was her Chief of Staff after she left office. But prior to that, he was also on the Hill. So he has this great understanding of, what's happening in DC, but also on the Australian side as well. And then sitting in between them, we have non-resident fellow Victoria Cooper, who, since she joined the USSC, she's been up to her eyeballs in everything US politics, all of our polling, really the sentiment readouts. She started right around the time of January 6th, and has a great read about what's taking place in terms of domestic policy, how things feel on the ground. And so they can help us to understand a lot of these really big grand strategy dynamics that we talked about. What might that look like, and taking the US perspective into consideration as well. So the first thing I just want to touch on, and so I'm going to go to Bruce first, is his chapter in the book takes a look at what can we expect in Congress based on this election. So that is a really critical factor. It gets to that structures point that Mike talked about. How those checks and balances play out, how those dynamics and those relationships work will depend a lot on who runs the House, who runs the Senate. So Bruce, why don't you talk us through the lay of the land following the election based on what we know now?
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Great first panel, absolutely wonderful. The Congress is up in the air just like the presidency. But I think my feeling is pretty strong that the Democrats will take back the House of Representatives. The Republicans control it by 1 or 2 votes, depending on who gets out of bed in the morning. And they did not win a big majority in the midterm elections because of their extremism, but also because of the force of the abortion issue, really, in key districts in suburban areas of big cities, not unlike the Teal voters here in Australia. So they came in with a margin of 5. It's now down to 2. They lost a speaker for the first time in the shortest speakership in history. And although Mike Johnson has done exceptional work under the most difficult circumstances, as Mike indicated, it's very tenuous. And the Democrats have been extremely united. They have raised more money. There have been many more retirements of Republicans than Democrats. You can always tell which way an election is going to go by who retires from the Congress at this time. And so I do expect the Democrats to hold their seats, gain in some suburban areas. There are like 14 congressional districts held by Republicans that Joe Biden carried in 2020. So I think that a narrow majority for the Democrats. In the Senate, it's a 51-49 Democratic majority in the Senate. There are no Republican seats up. Every 2 years, a third of the Senate is elected. Of the class up now, more than 2/3 are Democratic seats. That makes them more vulnerable. There are no Republican seats that Democrats hope to take back, so the focus is on Democrats. One seat in West Virginia, Joe Manchin's, he's a Democrat, will flip to a Republican, the governor, Jim Justice. That makes it a 50-50 Senate. And there are at least 7 Senate races of Democrats considered vulnerable. You have to think that 1 or 2 of them will flip as well, and it would be a Republican-controlled Senate. So what happens if, and how the Congress acts will depend on what happens, of course, with the presidency. If it's Joe Biden, Democratic House, Republican Senate, Joe Biden loves bipartisan deals. I think he's shown that he can do deals with Republicans in the first term. I think his focus will be, let's just continue as much as we can possibly do with them. And also, if Joe Biden is president, it means that Donald Trump will have lost, which means that he is at the apogee of his power right now. And if he does lose, then Republicans will be freer to break from his grip and do more things than they can do right now. So I see Biden president looking sort of like what has been produced in Congress this time. If Trump wins, all hell's going to break loose. If Trump wins in the House, if it is Democratic, they will block everything that he wants to do. I'm on the record here. Are we taping this? There will be a third Trump impeachment. Okay, that's coming, and so it's going to be ugly. And the Democrats, if they control the House, control the committees, which control the investigations and so forth. So it'll be very tough scrutiny. In the Senate, Trump will solidify further his hold over the party. Mitch McConnell is retiring. New leaders will be, a new Senate Republican leader will be chosen, and they will be more closely aligned with Trump on issues, particularly on foreign policy issues, on the Ukraine being a prime example of where that is. So, so Trump will, they will be aligned. What Trump will do, a Democratic House means that Trump's legislative program won't get enacted. So that will force Trump to act with executive authority in all the areas that he wants to act. And even if it's the provision in the defense bill that he can't withdraw troops from South Korea, he'll say, I'm commander-in-chief. I'm withdrawing the troops from South Korea. Take me to court. I've been in court recently. I know everything about the courts. I love lawsuits, and I have an attorney general who's going to back me all the way. So he will act even if it's extra legal, and that can run for several months at a time before he's reined in ultimately by the balance of power that exists under the Constitution. So that's, in brief, the outlook I see in Congress.
Okay, so still a split Congress, but both houses or both sides flipping.
Yes.
And then it sounds like if Biden is reelected,
It'll be a more benign atmosphere. If Trump is going to be very confrontational, but that will not stop him from acting.
yeah, and also a coalescing, interesting, around Republican support in the Senate, because the Senate has been a little bit less drawn into the MAGA side of things historically, but how that'll change with a new speaker and if Trump is reelected.
But again, if Trump is president, they're going to follow him because if you win, you go with the leader. If Trump loses, that's where Trumpism starts to recede. What does the political party want to do? It wants to win elections. If he's lost for a fourth time, Republicans will begin walking away. It will not be a return to the Ronald Reagan Republican Party that we had. It will be some hybrid of that, but it will be a retreat from Trump's extremism.
Okay, fourth loss is not the charm. Okay, I want to turn to you, John, because you were there in the Prime Minister's office, and there's he's having to work with the Trump administration, and then it changes, and there's a new administration to deal with. How did you approach that in terms of thinking about this administration, analyzing what's our strategy going to be, what's our approach going to be, and any advice you'd give as we look to this election coming up?
Thanks, Murray. So I guess just sort of historical footnote, in a way, Scott Morrison was the accidental Prime Minister, so the idea that we had lots of planning It sort of certainly wasn't like that. He became Prime Minister on Friday the 24th of August 2018. Early on the Saturday morning, we're in Parliament House getting briefings on this, that and the other, and first phone calls with world leaders, and someone says, you know, the White House is going to call on your mobile phone. I said, really? Haven't we got better communications, secure communications than that? So I wouldn't say we had a lot of planning time, I'm just saying. But I think Scott was sort of favoured by the fact that a number of people had really annoyed Donald Trump before he got there. So he already started with a fairly small base of international friends. Scott was expected to lose in 2019 anyway, so it was sort of pleasant, you know, centre-right government, there's certain affinity there. But it was really only after Scott won in 19 that the sort of relationship solidified. And look, I think, I mean, as Mike's point, most of it's not that hard. It's just don't do gratuitous, silly things, right? I mean, you sort of avoid own goals and you're sort of at least halfway there most of the time because, again, you've got the strength of the institutional connection, the cultural, the history, the structures, the alliance relationship. So a lot of the pillars are just there. So it's not like you're starting from a low base. And, you know, and then pretty much quickly we're then in COVID and we all know sort of the challenges of 2020 in that context. And they had a lot to do with each other. There's obviously the state dinner and all that. Yeah, but I mean, Scott benefited in part from, he didn't poke him in the eye. You know, I think someone said yesterday, or Jared said, only a very small number of state dinners, and one was Macron, and by the time we got there, Trump was already hated Macron by that point anyway. So look, again, I think it's just pursuing your national interests sensibly. Whether that's, and some of that you can't script in advance, some of the issues that just arise. But I guess the alignment was strong, certainly in the context of the China relationship, and once China started the sort of pointed economic coercion in 2020 as well. So there was a natural alignment around we're in this relationship of a different relationship with China in the context of strategic competition. So a lot of the critical minerals investment facilities started sort of initially a little bit the dialogue under Malcolm and then putting some dollars against it under Scott, and the current government's built on that. So a lot of it is just pursuing your national interests sensibly. I mean, I think with Trump, though, in terms of looking forward, I mean, basically every day he gets up and looks in the mirror, you sort of want to be in his bottom 50 list of resentments, right? So happily the Europeans will take up about the top 20. And so, yeah, look, you build on what and I think I probably also agree with Pete, you don't want to have a predetermined view as to wanting to be, well, you know, we need to talk to the president tomorrow, or we want to be in his face on this, or, well, actually, you may not want to be in his face too much. There is a certain degree of just wanting to get through it as well. And, you know, we got through it. So, yeah, look, I think we certainly shouldn't catastrophize about it. We should be very deliberately working every element of the multiple centres of power that are in Washington, the interest groups, as Mike said. Ideally, you know, he's put some stuff out there which others within the American system will say, Mr. President, we might want to think again about that. So, you know, we'll need a lot of allies to essentially navigate what will be a challenging time.
And just quickly, when it switched to Biden, when he won in 2020, and then was inaugurated in 2021, how did you approach that change in government?
Well, I guess that was, I mean, the interesting really joining together there was AUKUS, which was essentially Scott and Boris putting it to Biden, and climate. So you had this intersection of run up to Glasgow, what was Biden's obviously much more ambitious on climate goals. Australia's seen as a laggard. And I mean, this story sort of hasn't been written very much, but essentially net zero and AUKUS were bound up together as a strategic play. I mean, in a way, Scott had to drag the centre right towards net zero, in part because we knew if we didn't, Biden could lose his phone number, and we wanted to get AUKUS up. So, you know, you've got to be able to pick the big things that matter. Obviously, there's a differential in power, and how you can pragmatically secure your objectives, recognising that if I want you to do that for us, I'm going to have to do that for you. So.
Yeah. Now, I think that's a really good explanation of the ways that you can approach this in this different administration. We've talked about that pragmatic approach and what that looks like gaming it out. So one thing we've mentioned a little bit tonight, but Victoria, I want to turn to you, and I would say that is, you know, probably the biggest wild card in this election cycle and how it will play out beyond as well. But talking about the Trump trials, we cannot ignore the way that plays into things. Can you talk to us about your perspective of how that influences the election, and particularly, you know, sentiment in both the United States and abroad, and are those impacts significant or not?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I remember when I was trying to pick what degree to do, and I was like, no, I don't want to do law. I think I'll do politics, and yet here we are. Where somehow politics and law have just absolutely collided in a terrible and unexpected way. I think, this week especially has been a really interesting week when it comes to Trump and his criminal indictments. We've seen the first ever criminal prosecution of a US president, and just yesterday the jury, all 12 jurors, were set off with their instructions to deliberate. And that could be who knows how long until we get a verdict on that. But seemingly among Trump supporters, it doesn't matter whether it is a guilty verdict or a non-guilty verdict. At least 80%, according to recent polling, who voted for him in 2020 will vote for him again in 2024, regardless of the result of this election. Where this actually plays in a little bit more of an interesting way is when it comes to independence. It seems with these criminal trials that whether it's the Manhattan trial, whether it's the Boxers trial in particular, the January 6th cases are a little bit different. But especially with the Manhattan trial and the case of the Mar-a-Lago Boxers raid, which was where Trump was asked by the National Archives, some people call it the returning library books sort of case, where Trump was tasked to return some documents to the National Archives, and he didn't.
Do I have to do that?
Yeah. Got overdue library books, yeah. He had to turn over his archives and refused, and so his home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida was raided, and here we are, 40 felony counts later. So with this Manhattan case, people aren't particularly, people aren't watching is part of the issue. 16%, according to an MSNBC poll, 16% of those who say that they're not really watching the trial, 16% say that they're watching the trial closely. 30% say they're watching the trial, and the rest don't want to watch it. When we first started this trial in the middle of April, people were really jazzed up. They were like, wow, this is going to be huge. We're talking about hush money to a porn star. Wow. It's like very exciting. And then as the trial has worn on, people are bored. Americans are bored. People have stopped watching. When it came to actually talking about what the juries might actually do, people stopped paying attention, partly because it seems like these cases, especially the Manhattan case, isn't actually going to have a huge impact for Teflon Don, where nothing really seems to stick, and his loyal base of Republicans, which is about 25 to 30%, will back him all the way. But as I said, where this actually becomes a bit interesting is when it comes to independents. Independents are the largest voter cohort in the United States. Something like this year, Axios released data to say that, actually it was Gallup, to say that 49% of those who will be voting this year identify as independents, which means they don't vote loyally to either party. And these trials may actually impact how they think about Donald Trump. People tend to lean, if you're independent, tend to lean Republican or Democratic either way, but you can be more prone to persuasion. And this is one of those areas that might persuade you not to vote for Trump if he is indeed found liable of these criminal charges. But I think another way that these, and it's a bit more pragmatic, that these criminal charges is affecting Donald Trump is it's really dividing up his time. Already in February, he had a civil business fraud case in New York that saw $350 million, him liable to pay $350 million. In January, he was in court over a defamation lawsuit with Jean Carroll, which might actually get a third chapter this year. And now he owes $83.3 million to Jean Carroll. So there's an expense and there's a scheduling issue when it comes to these trials. And this Manhattan trial is the first, probably the only we'll see before the election, but he's still facing 3 more. And so all of these things, they're a burden on his time, they're a burden on his campaign finances, but the actual material impact on his loyal supporter base doesn't seem to be there. And his impact on the other public, it's actually really hard to tell. So I think a lot of the impact that these criminal cases will have will probably come in the autopsy of what happens in November, in months later.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this is most likely going to be the only criminal case against Donald Trump that has a chance of being, heard, sorted before the election, especially with what's happened recently with the documents case. That's kind of almost postponed quite indefinitely at this stage. Interestingly, if he's found not guilty, that's the end of it. It's done. But if he's convicted on anything, he's going to appeal, and it's going to go to the appeals court.
Or if it's a hung jury and it becomes a mistrial.
Yeah, and then it has to get heard all over again. So we're not done, but I guess if the trend is that people are bored, people are tuning out, then I guess the way it might detract people away from Trump will lose its effect. And so much of it comes down to who's going to motivate people to get out to vote, and how are they going to do that. I guess as we wrap up, before we hand to some audience questions, and then we'll have networking, I guess is there anyone we should highlight in terms of who key players might be in the next Trump or Biden, mostly Trump administration, because Biden, we assume there'll be a fair bit of continuity. Any key players that would be worth a mention and how we could engage with them?
Well, on the Biden, after the election, if Biden wins, there's going to be a whole change in the cabinet. There's no question about that. You'll have a new I believe you have a new Secretary of State, new Secretary of Defense, new Attorney General. I mean, it's generational. It has nothing to do. I think they all love working with President Biden, but they're going to be new people. But they will be in the same mold of expertise and experience as we have now. With Trump, the key thing, and it was discussed in the earlier, it's going to be loyalty. And when he gives an order, he's going to appoint cabinet officers who will absolutely follow what he wants to do. He's not going to have an Attorney General who says, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to appeal this thing." And he's not going to have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who says, "I'm not sending troops into American cities." And he's not going to have a chief of staff who takes pieces of paper off his desk so he doesn't sign them on a given day. And that is going to be the criteria by which he puts staff in. So it's going to be super loyalists.
Any other?
Look, I mean, Mark and others will know these people and read more tea leaves than I do. I mean, I think people like Robert O'Brien, potentially quite close still, and good connections with Australia.
Peter Navarro will probably be back. He's in jail right now, but he could be USTR again. He wants to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess Lighthizer still gets an awful lot of press. I don't think Lighthizer actually ever met Simon Birmingham as Australia's trade minister, though. Like, he literally did not get a meeting. So that was interesting. Yeah, look, I think Mike Gallagher gets talked about a lot. So, I think Bruce is right that it could be, there will be a loyalty test. But also, Mike is right that there will be Republicans who will genuflect Trump but won't necessarily agree with Trump. Now, that's different in the Congress than in the executive, and but also in the sense that we don't know what sort of Trump we're going to get. I mean, will he be the old man in a hurry, or will he be the guy that, great, I won, what's next, sort of thing. So I think we still don't actually know, and beware the old man in a hurry.
Yeah, and back in, it must have been 2021, when Victoria was a research associate, she published an explainer or a brief about key players in the Biden administration. I don't know if all of you know this, but it's been one of the most read articles on our website of all time. It's still getting read this year. So I guess, do you have any, looking at the next administration, any players that you would want to throw into the mix as well?
Oh, of the Biden administration.
Biden or Trump or
Well,
any
I have
names?
a statistic that I think is instructive with the Trump administration or potential next Trump administration, which is that when Trump said he was going to run again in 2024, 4 out of 44 of his cabinet secretaries endorsed his second run. And I actually, in preparation for tonight, have a list of things that Rex Tillerson, Mark Esper, John Bolton, James Mattis, Bill Barr, Mike Pence, these terrible things that they have said about what it was like to work under Trump. And I think in terms of what his next cabinet is going to look like, it's certainly not going to look like the first one. And I think a lot of the checks and balances of that cabinet, I don't know if they're going to be in place this second time round. And a particular position that I'd be looking after is the Attorney General.
One question. Who's going to be the vice president? Because that's probably the fastest road into the Oval Office.
Well, it's such a good question, and I think it's not going to be Mike Pence, but he's such an important part of the, I guess, litmus test about who it's going to be. I think, you know, if I was Trump and I was running a job interview for my next vice president, I would say, you know, it's January 6, 2021. You're my vice president. What do you do?
Who's it going to be?
Who's it going to be?
Yeah.
Don't know. I can't.
Well, here's my question, to turn it on you guys, and maybe Bruce, you have a view on this, but Trump, did he truth recently, or did he share somewhere, he did some flagging about how he'd do something around announcing his vice president at a historically black college. Do you think, obviously that would tip his hat towards saying, okay, Tim Scott, it's Tim Scott. Do you think that would be Trump playing a game? And where he wants us to think it's Tim Scott, or do you think that we could put any stock in that? Like, oh, okay, he's really angling.
He'll play games. This is The Apprentice all over again. He interviews everybody. They go. They're seen together. I think loyalty is number one. I think Tim Scott is the best overall choice. It's diversity. It's loyalty. He's been in the Senate. He has friends in the Senate, and I don't think he wants to upstage Trump at all. And he's been clear on all the issues when he's asked about, including, will you accept the outcome of the election? He says, well, we'll just have to see what the outcome is. So I think he's strongest place. A woman would be very good, just given Trump's, women are very hostile to Trump relative to men in terms of polling. So I think it's going to be one of the two. But Tim Scott is so again, more videotape, Tim Scott.
There's a lot of theatrics around it. I remember after Trump won the primaries, he kind of had all the previous Republican primary challengers kind of around him. And he started pointing and he was like, one of these guys might be my vice. It's just like, it's the theatrics of the choice. Like Doug Burgum now, the North Dakota governor, who was also a Republican challenger and Tory's Achilles tendon on the night of the first debate. He kind of called himself the underdog and then criticized Trump the whole time. And then when the Manhattan trial started, he was one of the first people there. And then Trump kind of came out and said, maybe Doug Burgum, as if. Like, it's just no star quality.
One quick point before question. Doug Burgum, I think, would be in the cabinet. I think he could be a fantastic head of OMB. He could be energy secretary. So watch him. He's going to be very good. Just two reset moments politically that are coming up in the next 30 days. There will be a verdict, one way or the other. If it's a hung jury, mistrial, Trump will say, I beat the rap in the communist, leftist, socialist, New York City. These Democrats couldn't even put me away. I'm a winner. His base is as solid as ever. The second, if he's guilty, then it will be, notwithstanding appeals and his believing that this is a terrible politicization, everything, he will be Donald Trump convicted felon. Those four words will be together from now till November. So it gets to Victoria's question. What's the support among independents or women or the Republicans who voted for Nikki Haley? Trump got 75 to 80% of all the Republicans voting in the primaries. That means 20 to 25% did not vote for him. Where are they going to go? And I've also seen polls, if he's convicted, that perhaps 10% of Republicans cannot vote for him. That could be important in an election where tens of thousands of votes in a handful of states will make the difference, just like it did in 2016 and 2020. The second reset moment will be the debate. It's a month from now. Trump, both men believe they can eviscerate each other. Trump wants to show that Biden is senile and can't string two sentences together. Biden wants to show that Trump is completely extreme and out of the mainstream of the country and you can't vote for him. If Joe Biden stumbles, if Trump wins the debate, that's going to set off ultra panic inside the Democratic Party. If he more than holds his own, has an edge coming, then they'll say, okay, we're with you. Let's just shore up the infrastructure so we can deliver these swing states. If the election was held today, Trump would win because of where the swing states are. But they're within 2, 3, 4, 5 points. That is winnable. But the enthusiasm factor for Biden is very, very low. The enthusiasm factor for Trump is very, very high. So the winner of the election is going to be who loses the least number of votes of their supporters. That's the winner.
Okay, that's a great note to wrap it on. And now I'm just going to we've got time for a couple of audience questions. We've covered a lot of topics, so there's a lot to pick from. So if you just want to raise your hand, we can bring a mic to you if anyone's got any questions. Otherwise, we can go to drinks. Okay, yes, Dan.
Thanks very much, Dan Crone, Mitsubishi. We talked about, in both panels actually, we talked a lot about the US team, but what about the Australia team? Is the Australia side ready for a potential Trump win? And given recent meetings, could Morrison play a role there?
I think that question might be best placed to you, John.
Look, I think they're certainly mobilised in Canberra much more than they were at the Prospect in 16, to the point where DFATs were actually set up an election unit specifically, although not all our American friends in Canberra think that's the smartest idea, but that's another topic. Yeah, look, I think the main things will be they do need to do the analysis, they do need to fan out, I'm sure, Ambassador Rudd and Ambassador Morrison, I'm joking. I'm sure that's all going on. Ultimately, the Prime Minister will have to own it. He won't be able to contract this out to the Foreign Minister or anyone else. He'll have to own a strategy. I think we need to be very smart around positive initiatives for alliance maintenance, as Pete said, or Jared as well. Like prepare for Trump, and these things. It won't be wasted energy, won't be wasted work. So come forward with meaningful, positive alliance management initiatives. That will generally be under a national security or economic security, national security umbrella. Yeah, I think then just be very disciplined. Be very disciplined. As Mike said, don't virtue signal to domestic politics and think you can get away with it, because you won't be able to. So I just think that, that will be a challenge on the left. And, I think it's fair to say the Albanese government's looking over its shoulder at the Greens a lot these days. So that will be a difficult, that'll take a bit of steel and a bit of discipline. So.
Great. All right. Well, please join me in thanking this panel. I'm going to invite Mike up to share some closing.
This is the part of the program where I do a vote of thanks, so I want to thank myself and the other panelists, thank our staff, thank all of you for coming. Look, American politics, it's the gift that keeps on giving. There will be more. We are going to be doing a lot on politics. As I said, David Sanger from the New York Times and others are coming to interpret what to watch in the election, but we're also doing a big conference in June on economic security. Gina Raimundo from Commerce is speaking. I keep saying keynoting. And
headline act. You can say that.
And Japanese, Korean, Singaporean, EU experts, officials making sense of the trade, critical minerals, export controls, economic security agenda. We'll have our annual conference this year after the election in mid-November. We've got a cast of about more than a dozen insiders from Washington on both sides who will help interpret not just what happened, but really what comes next and how to think about the agenda. So we want to follow the politics. It's exciting, it matters, it's consequential and interesting, but also keep a disciplined focus on the agenda because it is going to be characterized, we all think, by more continuity than change, and we need to keep that discipline. At this point, I always feel like I should apologize for American politics, but I know everyone loves it, so maybe I shouldn't. My favorite line about the U.S. Was from the 1980s when the European NATO foreign ministers were gathering to get ready for their first meeting with the Reagan administration, and all the European foreign ministers were whinging about the US. And the British foreign secretary said, yes, yes, everything you say about the Americans is true, but they're the only Americans we have. Let's get on with it. And that's sort of in that spirit that we meet tonight, and look forward to having you at our future events. So thank you.